Hey there, everyone. This is Samuel Johnson, and welcome back to the MCU Perspectives. And today we're going to be discussing the eighth movie to be released as part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Thor: The Dark World. I don't really know what else to say. Like, I guess I can talk about the lead-in for this film. Honestly, well, I guess when the film was announced, I was a little interested in seeing it. It was like Iron Man 3, I was interested in seeing where they would go, kind of another follow-up. I thought it would be kind of like a standalone sequel with some ties to Avengers, like they did with Iron Man 3. Since now Avengers had happened, I wonder where else they would go. So I was interested in seeing this film. I thought it would be kind of cool, and I wound up seeing it with a friend of with well not with the son of a friend of my mom's. And I thought it was okay when I first saw it, and then time passed. And, yeah. If you can't tell by my reactions, seeing this movie now, yeah. Well, let's get into the plot first. In terms of continuity, the film actually takes place at least some time after the Avengers. In this case, and by extension Thor. In this case, after the destruction of the Bifrost, apparently the Nine Realms have been in kind of a disarray. As such, after Loki's been detained since what he did in the Avengers, he has been locked in a cell underneath in Asgard while Thor and his friends, Lady Sif, Ballstag, the guy played by Prince Charming, who's no longer played by Prince Charming, and the Chinese guy, all go out and just kind of restore order across the Nine Realms. And the next time we actually see them is when they have pretty much restored order to the realm that the Chinese guy is from, and pretty much made everyone bow to Thor. This was at this point now. This was the last realm that had to be brought down to peace, and so with it done, Thor and his friends all go back to Asgard, though the Chinese guy stays behind. As such, Odin thinks that now that the realms are at peace, Thor can pretty much go on to become king. Although Thor doesn't seem to be in his right mind, and the reason for this is because he's still thinking about Jane. Odin tells Thor to just kind of get his mind off it. She's mortal, he'll outlive her. That he should just focus on his kingdom and what's in front of him, namely Lady Sif. But again, Thor isn't really as focused, and apparently he on certain nights he actually goes to see Heimdall so that he can check in on Jane and see what she's doing. In the meantime, though, on Earth, we see that Jane, Kat Dennings, I still forgot her character's name, and I wrote it down, but I'm currently using my phone as a light, so sorry, are currently in London, as well as a character named Ian, who's supposed to be Kat Dennings' intern, and that's all he really is. I mean, he does share a kiss with Kat Dennings at the end of the movie, but yeah, he's there. But and yeah, they're in London because Dr. Eric Selvig apparently called them there for something that's going on. Unfortunately, they couldn't catch up with him, and that's because, well, before they arrived, Selvig apparently went off his rocker and went to Stonehenge, stripped naked, and just started trying to implant these weird mechanical spikes around before he was eventually arrested and hauled off to the loony bin. As such, the group doesn't know this till they eventually see him on the news. Hold on a sec. I got a doggo here that wants to be on the bed because there's lightning. Well, not bed, chair. You know what I mean. So he's gonna be here now. But anyways, I was saying, as such, the group is just kind of trying to do their own thing and trying to be careful. However, some of Jane's technology starts kind of going haywire, and Kat Dennings ends up picking up on it when she goes to Jane's apartment to meet up with her, and well, finds it going nuts, and so she goes to meet with Jane while she's on a date with a guy. Jennifer does try to kind of push it aside just for the sake of this guy, but well, he tells her to go ahead anyway. And so they go to investigate, and apparently, ever since Thor, Jane has been on the hunt to try and find been trying to find the aforementioned God of Thunder himself, just like looking for any anomalies and trying to find and chase any leads that she can, just for the chance of running into him again. In this case, she eventually, as such, this is another. She sees this as another opportunity and goes to investigate where her device is leading her, and it leads her, Kat Dennings, and Ian to an old warehouse. They go in to investigate and find a group of kids who ask if they're the police. They say no, they're just scientists, and so the kids show them exactly what's going on. And it turns out that in the warehouse there seems to be a bunch of anomalies. Let's put it like there's a bus that all you have to do, that a bus can just be pushed up with the lightest touch and just kind of float there. And there's kind of a spiral staircase that if you throw something down it, then it will reappear it'll disappear and then reappear and keep falling down it. Though at certain points, eventually, it will just stop appearing altogether. As such, Kat Dennings thinks this is kind of cool, and they ultimately admit that some things don't return. And with one example being the car keys, which even they called him out for. But while Kat Dennings and the kids are just kind of seeing all this cool stuff, Jane's technology starts acting haywire as it seems to be finding more. It seems to be picking up a bigger source of energy. Jane goes to investigate by herself while everyone is distracted, and it eventually leads her to a hall that suddenly kind of sucks her to the end and eventually kind of pulls her into, I guess I can say, an invisible portal, because or just kind of in this case an anomaly, as we'll call it, that leads her to this strange dark cavern. And within the cavern is this strange stone that has this weird red viscous thing in it. Jane goes forward to investigate, but then as she gets closer to it, she reaches in and tries to touch it when suddenly this thing starts reacting and then suddenly just kind of gets absorbed into her. She then kind of falls back she then staggers and then falls unconscious, and back on Asgard, Thor goes to Heimdall to want to check in with Jane again, and apparently something that's going to be going. But as Heimdall is about to tell Thor about this, he says that he can't seem to see Jane anymore. As such, we cut back to Jane. We find that she's now woken up back in the warehouse, and everyone seems to be gone. Only when she goes outside, she finds that the authorities have been called, and when Kat Dennings sees her, she's like, oh man. She's like, Jane, where were you? And of course, Jane is like, what the hell are you doing? Why'd you call the cops? We had a lead, and our only competition was a bunch of 10-year-olds. But Kat Dennings counters that I had to. You were gone for like 5 hours, which Jane is a little surprised at. However, at that time, suddenly it starts raining, but as the two are arguing, they can't seem to notice that the rain seems to not be hitting them, as there seems to be a little circle that stops the rain. And when they both go to turn to see what's causing it, they see Thor staring at Jane. Jane goes to Thor, and we see that apparently the circle of rain is only on her, which causes Kat Dennings to just get soaked. And when she goes to Thor, she slaps him once to make sure he's real, and then she slaps him again as just because he never came back. And the last time he did come back was in Avengers, and he never looked her up. So she's not exactly happy with him right now. But he says that he had to go up. That the reason he never went back to see her is because with the Bifrost destroyed, the Nine Realms went into chaos. Because, well, I guess Big Brother, in this case Asgard, was no longer there to keep tabs on them. So he had to go out. So they had to restore order and all that and stop Loki. So. But in the meantime, he said he wanted to see her, and part of what was because she left Heimdall's vision. At that point, though, the police start coming by, and the police come by and they try to grab Jane. But just when one of them tries touching her, suddenly she just seems to explode in red energy, and that causes everyone to fly back. Thor is actually a little surprised at this, and the police, of course, want to immediately think she's dangerous and want to call him back up without, for some reason, not recognizing Thor. But at this point, Thor says that they need to do something, that something needs to be done about her, that something's wrong with her, and that they need to fix it. And so he calls the Bifrost in and has himself and Jane brought to Asgard, just leaving Kat Dennings behind. In the meantime, though, In the meantime, though, as this is going, actually, let's scratch that. We'll get back to that later. Sorry, never mind. I'll talk about that later. But yeah, they arrive at Asgard, and immediately Thor has Jane looked over. And of course, then the scientists on Asgard seem to find something within her that seems to be flowing through her body, something that's just kind of strange and odd, and that they can't seem to identify. Thor wonders if they can cure her, but before they can, Odin comes in and he's actually a little angry at Thor for disobeying him and going to see Jane, and even so far as bringing her to Asgard. Thor tries to argue, saying that something's wrong with her, and he says, she's sick. Humans get sick. They have people on their world called doctors who can take care of it. And so he tries to get the guards to come in to take Jane, but when they try to grab her, same thing happens to them that happened to the police. They're just blasted back, and immediately the doctors realize that whatever is inside her seems to be defending her, though Thor kind of guesses that it's defending itself. Odin, however, when he sees this, suddenly changes his tune as he realizes that he thinks he might know what this is. As such, he brings him to a book. As such, he brings Jane and Thor to kind of see this old book, and here's where we get some proper backstory. It turns out, and this is something that was shown at the beginning of the movie, and I neglected to talk about because it wasn't part of the main plot, but I'll kind of get all this out of the way right now. Apparently, a long time ago, back in the time of Odin's father, there existed a race of beings called the Dark Elves. Essentially, they're supposed to be a race that came from the darkness before the universe, and their leader was a dark elf named Malekith. Pretty much their end game in life is to bring the universe back into the darkness and just kind of blot out the light in all of its forms. And how they were going to do this was through this thing called the Aether, which is what Jane wound up absorbing. Pretty much, with the Aether, they were planning on using its power to just send out a destructive force across the entire universe, just coating it all in darkness and just kind of destroying everything. However, Odin's father, Bor, wound up leading an army against him, and before Malekith could absorb the Aether like Jane did, they unleashed the Bifrost on it and brought it to Asgard. As such, when the Asgardians were winning, Malekith pretty much did a tactical retreat and destroyed his own forces, just so that he, his bodyguard, and a handful of soldiers could live another day. But in the meantime, though, but Bor pretty much stated, rather than destroy the Aether, told them that they had to hide it, and we later learned that apparently the Aether can't be destroyed, so that kind of makes sense why he would do it. Hide it somewhere where hopefully no one will find it, but unfortunately that's where Jane found it. But unfortunately, Jane has found it. They say Odin does explain that the Aether is apparently one of several artifacts that seem to predate the universe. It's just that while the other artifacts have manifested as stones, important for later, the Aether is more viscous and can be easily more tangible, more formed, and it's a weapon connected to the Dark Elves as what Odin believes that Bor killed them all, so they're not a threat anymore. But Thor says that we thought that because apparently reports are that the Aether was destroyed, and yet here it is inside Jane, and turns out that when Jane absorbed the Aether, it called out to the Dark Elves, and they woke up. Like after Jane absorbed it, we wound up cutting to a ship in space, and inside it we saw Malekith and a handful of soldiers wake up as they realize the Aether has been found. As such, Odin decides to let Jane stay on Asgard because of the Aether. And unfortunately, something that even the doctors found out before Odin stepped in is that the Aether is not good for her body. As the more it's inside her, the more it steadily kills her. As such, they need to find a way to get this thing out of her before eventually it does her in. In the meantime, though, it allows Thor and Jane to spend more time together. But with the Dark Elves, we soon learn that they are aware of where the Aether is, and that they're now planning an assault to go get it. Their first plan, of course, Malekith wants to the first plan of attack is to get an inside man, and something the Dark Elves have is they have a group of warriors called the Cursed, spelled with a K because why not? A group of dark elves that sacrifice their own lives in service of it, and well, they don't die, but their blood is sacrificed, and it's used to make a stone that when they crush it, it pretty much morphs their body into a strange fiery monster that is extremely strong, very durable, and almost unstoppable, and almost completely unstoppable. As such, Malekith's second in command volunteers himself to undergo the process of becoming a cursed, and so Malekith does. And so they stab him, sacrifice some of his blood, give him a mask, and give him a stone. And so he manages to sneak into Asgard by pretending to be a prisoner. I don't know how it happened. Maybe he joined another ruckus. I don't know, and I don't care. Well, okay, I care a little. But as he's being led to the cells, we see Loki, and we did kind of check in with him here and there, and it turns out that Odin, when he brought him here, has kind of had enough to here. Has kind of had it with kind of had it with Loki's shit in the same way that Thor has, as he's angry with Loki for what he's done, but Loki still thinks that it's his birthright. He was told he was destined to be king, and that him attacking Earth and doing what he did, that was just him living up to his potential. Of course, Odin still is now angry with him at this point, as I think has stopped seeing him as his son, though he does keep him alive because of his wife, Frida. I'm guessing that's what her name is. I think it's pronounced something else, but don't quote me on that. Apologies, my dog might be getting a bit frisky right now as there's thunder out and he doesn't like it. So apologies in advance But anyways, yeah, Frida has been trying to make Loki's prison more bearable, giving him books, trying to keep him happy, and just trying to act like a mother. But of course, Loki, being Loki, is still still thinks that nothing's wrong. Although it does obviously Frida does obviously not. She's not happy about Loki, about what he's doing. Like, she still obviously loves him, but it's obvious that she knows that she can't. That she knows that he's a threat, and it's obviously breaking her heart a bit. Though we do see that Loki does care about her somewhat, while he still kind of at this point he's kind of disregarding Odin. But in the meantime, though, the cursed is brought to a cell along with the other people that are brought in, and I guess they don't search them, I suppose, though at the same time you can make the argument, though at the same time he hid the stone that would use to transform into a curse in the wound he had. But I don't know. I still think they probably would have. They probably should have searched. They probably still could have found it. But either way, he crushes it and begins transforming into the curse. And the other prisoners see that and start freaking out, trying to smack on the wall, saying, "Hello, help! Something's wrong." But as he transforms, it kind of fries the other prisoners in his cell and ends up and he then is able to break free is able to break out of his cell, which they have little energy walls that they use to keep them in as their bars. But as this is going on, though, there's an alert that there's something going on in the dungeon. So Thor and his compatriots go out to take care of it, leaving Jane with Frida. Though as this is going on, Heimdall notices that something seems to be coming into Asgard, and it turns out it's a cloaked dark elf ship, as he goes in and manages to damage it and even cause it to crash. Unfortunately, it was a scout ship, as he turns around and we see a much larger ship coming in with even more ships flying out of it and attacking Asgard. As such, the armies are drawn up, and Odin leads the charge, even having a brief moment to talk with Frida. And so Frida realizes that they realize that the Dark Elves are here for the Ether, so they need to get Jane somewhere safe so that they don't come after her. As such, Frida tells her, "Listen, you have to do what I say and don't do anything else. Got it?" And so Jane says yes. But yeah, things are pretty much just going to hell in a handbasket. Everything, like, there are ships flying all over the place, just shooting at it, Many of them trying to get into the palace. The cursed is breaking people out of prison to cause more mayhem and strife, so that to keep all the forces scattered. Though in the midst of it, he sees Loki and chooses not to let him out, because I'm guessing he looks Asgardian enough. But Loki tells the cursed before he joins the fray that if he wants to go, maybe he should take the stairs on the left, which the cursed does kind of contemplate for a second before taking his advice. And yeah, it turns out the way that he went led to a shield generator, as once the forces attack, Heimdall can use his sword to activate a shield that surrounds the main palace of Asgard, which does manage to stop a fair number of ships. But as it slowly starts going up, and I do mean slowly, like, oh my god, it's kind of slow. I'm surprised that the ships were stopped. But the curse managed to make it to the generator and smashes it, causing the shield to go down and allowing more ships to come in and to crash right into the main palace, including a ship that has Malekith in it. As such, the Asgardians try fighting against Malekith's forces, but they're kind of walked right through. But the Asgardians are walked right through as Malekith's forces have lasers, and while the Asgardian shields can obviously take it, they're armed with swords and shields, so yeah, they're kind of boned. On top of that, the Dark Elves have these grenades that, when thrown and explode, kind of cause an implosion on whatever's in the surrounding area before they're reduced to nothing. So yeah, there's no way you can beat that. As Malekith kind of goes to Frida's room and wants to know and immediately demands that she hand over the ether. Frida does manage to put up a good fight against Malekith, but eventually the curse comes in and manages to hold her down and hold her in place. And as this is going on, they see Jane in the corner, and so Malekith says, "You have something in mind that I want back." And so he goes up to Jane to try and take the ether. Only it turns out that she's an illusion that was cast by Frida. Malekith is obviously angry about this and wants to know where the heck she is, but Frida says that Frida says that she's not going to tell him anything. And Malekith says, "You know what? I believe you." And the curse stabs Frida in the back. Which, yeah. And so when this happens, Thor manages to come in, because he actually did hear all the commotion going on outside, and they did manage to quell the riots in the prison. And so the instant he sees this, and so once she's dead, Thor comes rushing, and he just screams, "No!" And he immediately takes his Mjolnir and zaps Malekith, which does manage to injure him enough into retreating. He and the curse do manage to get away by jumping off of the balcony they were on and onto a ship that flies away. But unfortunately, the damage is already done. Frida, Thor's mother, is in fact dead, and they do actually, and I will give the film credit. Her funeral scene is actually handled well, and actually handled well, and does carry a fair bit of emotion. You have some nice operatic music, some nice dark but soothing visuals. Seeing them put her out on a little pyre with all these flowers and lights around her. Seeing Odin light up an arrow and then shoot it at her as it's led away, and as her resting place starts going towards the falls of Asgard, Odin says a prayer, and suddenly instead floats out and then turns to light, which flies up into the heavens. And suddenly we see these orbs fly to the sky. It's beautiful, operatic, with no dialogue, and we even see Loki down in his cell, who, as the riots are going on, he was just sitting around reading a book. But a guard goes up to tell him that his mother's dead, and put simply, he does not take it well. Like I said, he did still care about her. Despite what happened, she still was nice to him. She still treated him like her son. And now she's dead, and Loki is not exactly happy. With this in mind, however, Jane starts kind of having this in mind, however, Jane is starting to have some visions with the Aether, as she was with the ether in her, as she starts seeing visions of Asgard's skies red, and suddenly just blackness sprouting around it, the ether crawling over everything, and it is creepy imagery, but the vision quickly goes away, and a few guards come to apprehend her. And it turns out the reason for this is because Odin is now kind of ticked off and kind of a little bit on a warpath. Thor does learn about what happened with Jane, so he goes to confront Odin, and Odin reveals that, yeah, he's planning to use Jane as bait, because Malekith wants the Aether, and since the Aether's in Jane, all they have to do is just keep her, and Malekith will come back to Asgard, and they can wipe him out. Thor thinks this is a stupid idea, as it will risk many innocent Asgardian lives, and would and in failure. But Odin says he doesn't care, and he'll do as many lives as he takes as long as he wins. Thor does try to propose an alternate route. Thor, in the meantime, tries providing an alternate solution, that they bring Jane to the Dark Elves world, in this case, the Dark World, and use her, and have Malekith draw out the Aether. At that point, once he draws it out, Thor will destroy both the Aether and Malekith, and everything will be go hunky dory. But Odin counters, saying that what if this plan goes wrong, and then it would just lead to Malekith getting the very thing he needs, and that's something they don't want. So he's going to go ahead with his plan, whether Thor likes it or not. Thor tries saying that, well, if you do this, what makes you any different than Malekith? And Odin's response is, because I'm going to win. As such, Thor decides that he needs to go behind Odin's back a bit. He can't. He still wants to go. He does plan to go. He still wants to go to the Dark World and get the Aether out of Jane, but there's still a few problems. One, Heimdall was ordered to stand down from the Bifrost, and because, well, they don't want anyone getting in or out of Asgard unless it's the Dark Elves, so they can't really get up. So even if they wanted to leave, they can't. Though Heimdall does help them out, he's just still very loyal. Actually, now that I think of it, he probably could have still opened a gate if he's betraying them, but what do I know? Maybe they would have noticed. Maybe it would have been too obvious. They wouldn't have been able to follow. I don't know. It's just... Actually, it kind of doesn't make sense that he doesn't directly do it. Never mind. But either way, he won't open the gate for them directly because of orders, and I guess it would be a bit too conspicuous. 2, Jane is still under lock and key. And 3, while they don't know any other way out, as they know that there are hidden pathways, but they can't access them. Thor knows that there are hidden pathways, he just can't access them, which is where he has to set his plan in motion. He ends up gathering Lady Sif, Balstag, and not Prince Charming, along with Heimdall, and they realize that they have to do a plan, that they have to kind of get a bit sneaky here, as if Odin catches, as what they're doing is kind of tantamount to treason, as what they're doing will be against Odin's orders. But at the same time, as such, he has the group come together, and they kind of realize they need to kind of get a plan in mind. And this plan unfortunately means that Thor might have to rely on Loki, as he's the only one that knows where those hidden paths are, that he was able to get Sorry, I'm just wondering if the thing moved. I'm sorry, never mind. Anyways, I was saying, he's the only one that knows where the hidden pathways are, as he was able to direct the ice giants in the first Thor film too. So odds are he might have used those to reach the Chitauri in Avengers, so they kind of need his help. As such, Thor goes down to Loki's cell, and at first everything looks nice. Loki looks just as nice the last time he saw him, and his cell looks orderly, but Thor says, just knock off the illusions. And yeah, it turns out it was all just an illusion Loki cast, as after he heard about his mother's death, he pretty much went apeshit in his cell. Everything, like, all the furniture is tossed all around, it's all trash. Loki's disheveled, his clothes are kind of ragged. He is, not very well. Thor, in this case, goes to Loki and says that he wants his help in this, and Loki is just wondering why would he think he can trust him, and Thor says no, he doesn't trust him. He doesn't trust him at all. In fact, and because of everything that happened in Avengers, all hope that he had of having his brother back are pretty much just gone, so if Loki shows any sign that he'll betray him, he'll probably kill him. But he knows that Loki cared for their mother, and so he thinks that Loki will help him out just for a chance at revenge. And Loki just kind of responds with, well, when do we start? As such, Thor lets Loki out of his cage, and we get a nice humorous scene where Loki uses magic to first disguise himself as a generic soldier, then changes Thor to look like Lady Sif, and then he switches over to Captain, and then he makes himself look like Captain America, and it's really funny. And another compliment I'll give to this movie, they make Loki, like, I think the kind of the most fun villain we've seen so far. In all of these films, like, he's kind of the most fun villain. Like, like, I already thought Loki was a decent villain before this. Like, again, I mean, his motivations in Thor were I thought were understandable, and you did feel a bit sorry for him. He was actually sneaky and underhanded. He did kind of show himself as a force to be reckoned with, though he still was kind of a wooby in the fact that even with all that power, he was still kind of tossed aside. But here we get more of the mischievous side of Loki, seeing him teasing Thor, making fun of him. We get some nice character interaction with that, and especially when he switches over to Captain America and just starts mocking him ruthlessly by pretending to be him. It's actually really funny. But in the midst of it, Thor puts Loki in cuffs. But eventually ends with Thor putting Loki in cuffs, and so their plan kind of involves going to the main hall where one of the Dark Elves' ships crashed, and it's still there. As such, they managed to go in there and they managed to enter the main hall, though they do encounter resistance from guards who see Thor with Loki and realize, hey, they're not supposed to be doing that. However, Lady Sif and Ballstag end up causing two separate distractions to allow Thor and actually no, scratch that. First they go to get Jane. Sorry, their first stop is to get Jane, and so Lady Sif of course Lady Sif helps distract them and so Thor manages to knock out the guards and free Jane. And so after Lady Sif distracts those guards, they go to where the Dark Elf ship is, and Volstagg distracts those guards while Thor, Loki, and Jane get on the Dark Elf ship. And while Thor does have some problems getting the Dark Elf ship up and running, because it's a ship from an entirely different culture, odds are you're probably going to have problems getting that thing up and even wondering how to even finding out where the bathroom is. They do manage to get the ship. They do manage to activate the ship and get it flying out. Of course, Odin sends all these ships to go after them, and even Heimdall states that he's supposed to report any traitors, and so he does actually, as a brief distraction, he does call Odin Odin a handful of soldiers to his chambers and claims that says that he's betrayed Odin, just as Thor and Loki on the Dark Elf ship managed to fly out. Odin then gives the order to take them down by any means necessary, and so they get a shoot as they're flying around. They're getting shot at, and of course Loki is just constantly giving Thor crap throughout the whole thing. But as they're flying along, Loki just keeps saying, "Well, this is a great plan, wasn't it? Grabbing the most conspicuous ship possible and making an ass of yourself, yada yada yada." But to that, Thor grabs Loki and pushes him out of the side of the ship before grabbing Jane and jumping out after him. And it turns out that was actually part of their plan, grabbing the most conspicuous thing they could, having all of Asgard's forces chase after that, while Thor, Jane, and Loki would jump off to a smaller ship that was piloted by not Prince Charming. As such, Loki's a bit impressed that Thor was able to trick him like that, but they still are not out of the woods yet, as there's still another ship coming up after them. And so Thor tells Loki that he needs to get him to Thunder and Lightning. Then he needs to direct him to one of their hidden pathways, which Loki is able to oblige while not Prince Charming once again distracts the guards. As such, Loki manages to direct the ship to what looks like a mountain, which Thor thinks he's crazy for even heading towards, but Loki says that he probably is. And they manage to direct it into a small little crevice in the mountain, which it turns out leads to like a mini Bifrost, which Loki is able to use to transport the ship to the Dark World, though it does sustain heavy damage just from just skidding along and I guess being blasted at, but don't quote me on that one. As such, but it still manages to fly, and as we see Malekith kind of recovering from his attack by Thor, as we see that half of his face has been charred and turned black, we see his forces mounting to go for another assault on Asgard, but until Malekith says, no, we don't need to, the Aether's already come home. As such, we get a nice moment between Thor and Loki as we kind of see them actually talking, and we see them clashing and even arguing about their mother's death. And it's a nice moment, and Thor says which ends with Thor saying, "I want to trust you, I want to trust you, but I know I can't." And Loki says, "Well, then trust my rage." And so they realize that they need a plan when they go to confront the Dark Elves. And of course, they go to where the Dark Elves ship is. And so Thor, Jane, and Loki are kind of standing there, and they say, "Do you know the plan?" "Yeah." And so Thor takes Loki out of his cuffs and says, and says, I hope I can trust you. And Loki says, you probably are better not doing it. As Loki takes out his daggers and seems to stab Thor. Thor seems to just kind of recoil and fall down the dune they were standing on, rolling down with Loki chasing after him, talking about how he never cared for Frida or anything. He just wants to see Asgard burn. And so as Thor is trying to cover this, he tries to summon Mjolnir, only for Loki to once again supposedly chop off his hand before Mjolnir can land in it. And so he goes to Malekith and says that, Malekith, I offer you this girl. I give you a gift. As he grabs Jane and pushes and throws her towards him, and he says, all I ask is that I get to watch Asgard burn. And so the curse tries to say, I saw him in prison on Asgard. We can probably trust him. And so we see Malekith hold out his hand to Jane, and suddenly she starts floating as he raises her up, and he does actually manage to pull the ether out of Jane. She then falls to the ground until Loki says, Thor, brother, now. As it turns out that Loki stabbing Thor and cutting off his hand was just more of Loki's illusion magic. As Thor's hand reappears, he summons Mjolnir and just blasts right at the Aether, causing an explosion, supposedly destroying it. Unfortunately, though, the plan was doomed to fail, as immediately upon its destruction, the pieces of the Aether start to reform, which I think makes sense. It's a viscous thing that doesn't have a solid form. It would apparently so it kind of makes sense that I guess you could pretty much mold it into anything, and it would eventually, and you can, without being able to break it. Hold on a second. Sorry, Xander is freaking out because of the thunder. As I was saying, Malekith reforms the Aether and absorbs it into him. At that point, he immediately heads out while he and a few of his guards head back to their ship, while the Cursed and some of his soldiers stay behind to try and deal with Thor and Loki. With Jane kind of no longer being on their radar because, the Aether's out of her. However, something I didn't mention is that while Jane had the Aether sucked out of her, she had a vision of Earth, of the Earth suddenly going into eclipse as it's suddenly being coated in the Aether, and just seeing it spread out across the stars and just continue growing and growing. As such, as things continue going on, we see Thor dealing directly with the Cursed, while Loki fights off some of the soldiers, and he manages to kill them. Managed to grab one of their implosion grenades. Thor is trying to summon Mjolnir to fight the Curse, but it keeps knocking him aside and easily just seems to be beating him. However, before it can lay the final blow, Loki apparently stabs it from behind with a sword, only for the Curse to turn around and stab Loki on it as well. However, as it throws Loki to the ground, Loki's kind of smiling and I think he said something along the lines of that he wants it that he hopes it about that it'll pay or something, and then looks to its belt and it realizes that the active implosion grenade has been attached to it. Before it can grab it and throw it away, it goes off and kills it, which I think makes sense. This thing was the thing that directly killed his mom, so of course I think he would have something painful in mind for it. But Loki supposedly is just kind of on the ground dying, and Thor tries to tell him, Loki, don't know you did. It's like no, Loki, and as Loki seems to be losing his color, Thor tells him, I'll tell father what you did, and Loki says, I didn't do this for him, before quote unquote passing on. I say quote unquote because of things that are happening. As such, immediately after he dies, and I do mean like immediately after he dies, Thor and Jane kind of recuperate in a cave, not knowing what to do next. And Jane says that and tells Thor about her vision as she saw that darkness encompassing the earth. He says, why is it happening there? And this is where we kind of get into a plot point that I've been neglecting to mention throughout this whole synopsis. You see, at the same time that all this is going on, another event is happening. Something called the Convergence, which is actually responsible for the anomalies that Jane wound up encountering earlier in the movie. You see, the Convergence is an event that happens once every 5,000 years. And what it does is that for a brief moment, all 9 realms will overlap briefly, causing anomalies, gravity causing gravity like such as the portals leading to other worlds and areas, the light gravity, etc. Laws of physics themselves are going to be screwed up by this event. Oh, look at you. Which is why Dr. Selvig which is where Dr. Selvig came in. It turns out that when in the film we cut back to him he's in the loony bin as he's trying to explain that what he was trying to do is that the convergence would pretty much just cause all of laws of physics to go nuts, and the best way to keep everything from going insane was through his spikes. That if positioned properly, would allow everything to level out and allow the convergence just harmlessly pass over them without any major problems. It's also here we get our Stan Lee cameos to demonstrate the convergence. He used a pair of shoes, and once he's done with his demonstration, Stanley asks if anyone has any questions, and Stan Lee says, "Yeah, can I have my shoe back?" And yeah, but yeah. As this went down, Kat Dennings and Ian managed to get him out of the asylum by claiming that Ian was Dr. Selvig's son. And so as they're walking out, Dr. Selvig sees as the convergence gets closer, more anomalies are occurring as we see a flock of birds flying through the sky suddenly disappear, only for the flock to reappear right under the group and fly into the sky. And so Dr. Selvig thinks that it's kind of nice knowing that that when the world's crazier than you, you're fine. And so he takes the medication that he was given and tosses it in the garbage. And apparently the reason he's nutso is because of what happened to him in Avengers when Loki used his staff to metal inside his head. But pretty much at this point they're trying to study the convergence and try and find ways to keep everything from going haywire. But in the meantime, though, it turns out that the Dark Elves actually want to take advantage of the convergence. As like I said, the convergence is a moment in time when all the 9 realms are overlapping with each other. As such, if they use the Aether at the epicenter of where the convergence is happening, which it turns out is actually Greenwich in London, though Thor and Ko don't learn that till later, he can use the Aether's power to coat all the realms in darkness and pretty much destroy everything. Thor and Jane are able to figure out that that's why Jane had that vision. But they're still left with the same problem. They're still stuck on the Dark World. However, Jane suddenly gets a phone call. Her cell phone starts ringing. Jane's wondering how the heck she's getting service. And yeah, it turns out it's the guy she was on a date with. And so as Jane starts looking around the cave wondering what the heck's going on, she manages to find many of the items that were lost, including the car keys and several shoes, as Kat Dennings wanted to toss in shoes into there to see what happened. As such, Jane realizes that this might be their ticket out, and sure enough, it is. As they wander through the cave, disappear, and wind up back outside the warehouse in London. As such, with the keys of the car again, Jane is able to find their car and go out, with Thor asking who Richard is, and Jane saying, "Not now, please." And so they manage to go back to the apartment where they find everything, where they find Ian, Kat Dennings, and Dr. Selvig trying to study the convergence. As such, they do manage to narrow down that it will be in Greenwich, as I said before. But at the same time, they need a plan of attack for when Malekith and the Dark Elves appear to unleash the Aether. As such, they go in there the next day, and we see that they're positioning the spikes in several key places around Greenwich, or at least around the point of a convergence. And what they're planning to do is that they're planning on using the spikes to essentially interact with the anomalies and create their own, essentially. As once the Dark Elf ship lands, Thor, of course, lands on the ground to confront Malekith. And so it leads to a brief fight, and in the fight, they're using the spikes to pretty much teleport certain soldiers to certain locations, though it kind of gets though Kat Dennings and Ian get pulled to the side with other soldiers, but things are still going haywire as in the middle of Thor and Malekith's battle, they get caught in their own anomalies and just kind of get thrown all over and get tossed all over the place to, at some point high in Greenwich, to Jotunheim with that giant monster that Thor and his friends encountered in the first Thor film, to back to the Dark World, to them landing on a glass window, and in the midst of the battle, Thor ends up losing Mjolnir as it ends up flying through an anomaly and lands back on Earth, so it's just flying all over the place trying to get back to Thor. But as things continue things are still just going all haywire and going nuts, and eventually Thor and Malekith get separated, with Malekith back in Greenwich where the convergence is going on, while Thor ends up on a subway. Thor manages to get back to Greenwich by taking the subway, but at this point all the worlds are opened up, and Malekith starts unleashing the ether on them, trying to coat them all in darkness. Thor As such, when the group arrives to see what Thor's doing, they think to see Malekith. They realize that they think they might be too late, but Thor says no. Thor says no, that he may not, and so he thinks if we can, and so he thinks that maybe he can use the spikes. And he says, will those things work? And they say we have to get close, and so Thor takes 3 of the spikes and manages to charge into this and manages to get close to Malekith. As he's unleashing the ether, it's causing like a big giant red dust storm around them, which is kicking up wind and everything. Malekith says that this can't be stopped. The aether can't be destroyed. But Thor says no, but you can. And so he throws one of the spikes at Malekith's arm, and as Jane and Co pick up the energy signature from the spike, they manage to use it to teleport his arm to another dimension. He goes to the other arm and does the same thing, but Malekith he still thinks he's gonna win. As the aether is coursing through his veins, 2 arms gone doesn't mean that it's gone it means that the 2 arms gone doesn't mean that it's gone now. Doesn't mean that it's gone. However, Thor manages to throw a spike directly into Malekith and throws it, driving it in, especially with Mjolnir. And so he's able to activate one last pulse that sends Malekith to the Dark World and away from the Convergence. As this goes on, Thor seems to pass out from the explosion, and it's rather anticlimactic. But with the chunk of the ship that Malekith flew into now gone, the ship starts falling over, and Jane starts running out to try and protect Thor, only for the ship to suddenly vanish. And the reason for that is because, well, Dr. Selvig managed to activate one more anomaly and sent the rest of the ship to where they sent Malekith, as it ends up falling right on top of him and crushing him. Pretty much destroying him and, I think, releasing the ether, which eventually the Asgardians go to collect. As such, Jane checks on Thor to see if he's okay, and Thor, it turns out, is completely fine and alive and well. In the meantime, Thor goes back to Asgard. In the meantime, we cut to a couple days later, where Jane, Selvig, Ian, and Kat Dennings are sitting around a table just kind of eating, and they're wondering where Thor is, and they're thinking that maybe this might be a repeat of what happened at the end of Thor, that he may be gone and not tell them what's going on, but Jane says that it's only 2 days, we'll see if we can give him a chance. And we cut to Asgard, where we see Thor bowing for Odin, and pretty much just pleading with him, saying, I'm not fit to be king. Like, I'll protect Asgard to my last breath, but I don't want to be king. And this isn't just because of Jane. I would be saying this stuff with or without her. I'm just not a king. As such, Odin does sound disappointed, just saying, I have a son that wanted the throne too much, and a son who doesn't want anything to do with it. Is this my legacy? But Thor tells him that no, your legacy is something greater. And so Odin pretty much does concede, but he does say that he can't say anything. He can't wish him good tidings or anything like that. But he says that I also couldn't say that I'd be proud of my son. That'd be coming from the heart. And so it's just kind of a nice little farewell as Thor goes on his way. Only the instant Thor leaves the main chamber, it turns out that the Odin he was talking to was actually Loki in disguise. It turns out that Loki actually did survive on the Dark World. My guess is that he actually did stab the cursed, and then put the grenade on him, and then stepped away while the illusion got stabbed. And then he wound up returning to Asgard dressed as the generic soldier and met with Odin, where he wound up doing something to him and then replaced him. What that something is, we don't learn till a later film, but for now, Loki is now taking the place of Odin and now rules Asgard. As such, the film ends with our after credit scenes, where we see Thor returning to Earth and going back to Jane and them kissing, while the monster from when Jotunheim is still loose on Earth. I love how that never got fixed. But then we also get our during the credits scene, as we see Lady Sif and Volstagg walking around this strange zoo, I think? It's just weird place with all these strange alien artifacts and creatures all locked up in cages as they're being led by a red lady that introduces them to a being called the Collector. The Collector gives them good tidings and they present to him the Aether, and it turns out that they did, and like I said, they did capture the Aether and managed to put it in a box. And so he asks, well, why don't they just keep it on Asgard in their vault? And they state that they state something that's also still plot important. The Tesseract is already at Asgard. It wouldn't be safe to have two Infinity Stones close together. Something that the Collector wholeheartedly agrees with, and so he graciously accepts the Aether and allows Volstagg and Sif to go on their way. Although once they're out of earshot, he holds the Aether in his hand and says, 1 down, 5 to go. And that's the last we see for this film. So, what do I think of this film? I hesitate to call it awful. But with that being said, this, I think, is the low point of the MCU. Like, other films so far have kind of ranged from all right to from good to pretty good to acceptable and to decent to just acceptable. But this is the film that I think many agree on is kind of the lowest point in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And yeah, it is. This film is dull. It is a dull film. Like, I think its first big problem is something I didn't notice till like the third act. It's got pacing issues. The first Thor film, while it did feel underwhelming, actually did have a very well-paced plot with some good build-up aside from the first act, some good pacing, some nice development here and there, some good character interactions, and just some nice payoff and enough time given to each moment to actually give it weight and weight that helped you get invested in the characters and the situation and what was actually happening in the story. But this film, unfortunately, doesn't have much of that. It does have a plot that's going on, but it seems strictly business for the most part. There are, especially around the third act, as you go through the plot, it seems like it moves fast enough so that you know there's a story going on, but it moves fast enough so that you don't get as invested as you should be in the plot. Like, again, going back to the third act, after Loki is dead and Thor kind of spends like a second saying, mourning over his body, it immediately cuts to Jane and Thor as they wander in the cave, and they immediately get back to business. And the climax is just like that. We see Malekith unleashing the Aether across the 9 worlds as the convergence is going on, and Thor's response is, "Give me the spikes! Stab, stab, boom! We've won! We've won! Bad guys defeated! We win! Bad guys defeated! Who wants lunch?" That's unfortunately and that's just kind of how it is, and the rest of the film kind of has a similar feeling to it. It feels like it's a little rushed in some areas, though that might just be easily in the third act. But even in other areas, it feels like not a lot of weight is given to certain things, and it feels like it should, which unfortunately makes you less invested in the overarching plot. And again, it's especially harder in the third act, and near the third act, it's like the film is just trying to get itself over with. Like, it's like, okay, we're near the third act. Let's just move along. We want to get out here as quickly as the audience does. It's just, and it kind of takes you out of the film. Like, and the first 2/3 weren't bad. But it's when you get to the final third that you kind of start getting drawn out of it. Like, it's like the first 2/3 of this film, I thought to myself, well, this isn't great, but I'm not being drawn out of it. But then you get to the third act, and they get to the dark world, and suddenly I'm starting to stop, and suddenly I found myself just caring less and less, until by the time it was done, I thought to myself, well, that was a thing. And unfortunately, that's unfortunately a big flaw with that. And I guess you can go back to the rest of the plot. It's very business, and like with the first film, it's a bit underwhelming in certain things. Like, unlike the first film, you have more of Asgard in it. You see more of that. You see more of Asgard in it. You see other worlds besides Earth. But a problem is that Asgard, for one thing, is a place you've already seen before, and unfortunately, this film seems to downplay it. Like, in the first film, Asgard looked freaking beautiful, large, ornate, golden rooms. Even the smallest rooms looked so royal and just kind of nice to look at, and so great. But in this film, it's downplayed. They shrunk things down and made it a little less. They kind of make it look less ornate. As a result, it kind of makes the film suffer to a degree, which I don't like. I don't like that at all. At all. It just kind of makes it feel less. And the new stuff we do see isn't really that good. Like the world that Thor and his friends are saving in the beginning, the one that the Chinese guy is from. Again, apologies, I don't remember his name. Like all we see of that is a small village in a forest. Which, yeah, we have forests on Earth. The closer we see something spectacular is a rock monster. And Thor kills him right away. And I made a pretty humorous scene as he comes up and Thor just knocks him aside. Anyone else want to go? Which, yeah, that's kind of amusing, but that's not... And the Dark World... Yeah, the Dark World's nothing. It's just a bunch of ruins and sand and dark. It's bland. It's bland! And unfortunately, that unfortunately also goes to the characters. We still have the same characters that we got in the last film, and unfortunately, they have as much impact in this film as they did in Thor. Kat Dennings is not funny. Ian is just there. Like, he doesn't do anything major to the plot aside from just general stuff that Kat Dennings and Dr. Selvig would probably do without him. The closest thing he has to actually doing something... Sorry, you probably heard an alert because my phone's right there, so it's probably going to be louder on your end. But the closest thing he does is that when he and Kat Dennings are being cornered by Darcy, that was her name. Her name was Darcy. As he and Darcy are being cornered by Dark Elves, he manages to use the anomalies to his advantage as he manages to grab a car and crush them with it. Like, that's the only thing he's done. That's the only that's the only thing he does in this whole film that's wholly his own. Otherwise, he's just there. And that's it. He's just there. Dr. Selvig at least does have more reason to be here, as he's the one that created the spikes and he's the one that had his little freak out. But otherwise, he's just there, and it doesn't help this. And it's the same with Thor's friends. They do more stuff, but they're just as generic as in this film as they were in Thor. Like, not Prince Charming, if you weren't looking, you probably wouldn't notice that they changed actors. Lady Sif and Volstagg, I still only know because Lady Sif's the only girl, and Volstagg is a name that I cannot get out of my head. Even then, they do help out in some ways, but they're still just there to help Thor in the end, which is still a problem. And again, the climax still kind of sucks because it does feel more rushed, and they try to make it more creative by having all the anomalies teleporting Thor and Malekith all over the place. But it feels too quick, too fast paced, and doesn't have a lot of pauses, but just enough so that it doesn't really keep you invested in the action. And it also helps that it also doesn't help that the villain sucks. Like, the other villains I didn't like. I will openly admit the villains aren't that great in other films, but the Dark Elves and Malekith suck. Which I don't like saying, because Malekith is played by Christopher Eccleston. I like Christopher Eccleston. He's a good actor. He was on Doctor Who. I liked his Doctor. And he's a very good powerhouse actor. And and to his credit, he does provide enough raw emotion for Malekith. But Malekith is... aside from the raw emotion, he's bland as hell. What's his motivation? He wants to bring the worlds to darkness because that's the order of everything? That's a pretty lame-ass motivation, if you ask me. It's a very dumb motivation, and that's all we get from them. There's nothing quotable about him. He's generic as hell. He's just there. Most of the time he's not speaking English. He's not quotable. He's not fun. He's not terrifying. He's just bland as hell, and I hate him. I don't like him. He's my least favorite Marvel villain so far, and I don't like him. And on top of that, the action feels underplayed as well. Like, again, in Thor, they did have that sort of thing when Thor was on Earth, but they were able to make up for it by having the cool. But when they actually did have the cool effects, oh my god, they went all out, and it was so fun. But part of it, but it seems another flaw with the film trying to underplay it in some areas is not just Asgard going down, but some of the effects seem to have lost their luster, which, yeah, I don't like. It's a problem, and that's a big problem that permeates through the movie. And unfortunately, these flaws do keep me from liking the movie. Like, you got pacing issues that feel like they make the movie too much business, not enough character interaction. The side characters still don't add as much to the film as they should. The villain is bland. All the environments are either bland, done before, or just not that interesting. The climax is dumb. All of these issues to combine do keep me from liking the movie. But with that being said, though, I hesitate to call this thing awful, as there are some things in this film that I think are alright. For starters, the acting. The acting is still good. Is still mainly good. Chris Hemsworth does still play a good job with Thor. Odin is still played greatly. Same with Jane. And like I said, while Malekith may not be a good villain, Christopher Eccleston does still kind of give him a powerhouse. Does still give a powerhouse performance that does still give enough strength and anger to the role that you kind of still take him seriously enough, even under all that makeup. On top of that, Loki, I think, is a breakout star in this. Like, you see him be, like, as the self-proclaimed god of mischief, you don't see him acting very mischievous in the other films. Like, I wouldn't say he's a bad villain in them, but he wasn't very mischievous. Here, he's a lot more, because he and Thor share more moments together, we see them exchanging banter. We see Loki being kind of a smartass, taking potshots at Thor and his friends, giving crap to them, just kind of rolling with the punches, and eventually again, his sliminess does manage to get him on top as he manages to send Odin somewhere while he impersonates him and takes the throne of Asgard with nobody suspecting. Even Thor, who actually goes to him and says, "I don't want to be king," and Loki just kind of lets him go with it, saying, well, "Okay, then you can go," and you manage to play the role perfectly while making everyone think that he's dead, having died a hero's death. It's nice, and I do like that. And there are some legitimately funny moments here and there scattered throughout that I think work, and there are some legitimately nice emotional moments. Like, again, when we actually do have Thor and Loki talking to each other after their mother's death, seeing them work off each other, seeing that anger boiling through as they both hate each other for various reasons. Loki, because he felt he deserved the throne and he got passed over for this oath and the dreadlocks, while Thor being betrayed by his own brother who caused all this monster, but both of them able to come together over the love of their mother and both willing to help each other and actually play to each other's strengths, which is actually really nice. And again, the stuff when their mother, when she dies, I think is actually really strong emotionally. It does provide some good moments here and there. And it does provide some actually good it's very strong, very heartfelt, very emotional. It actually is played out, actually it does get the time it deserves to actually let the death sink in for the characters. Again, because of the rush nature, when she actually does die, it doesn't really hit you as much as it should. But the resulting after effects do kind of give it a nice gravitas that does make you care enough to actually feel something for her death. And on top of that, we also get some nice mythos building. Again, like, Iron Man 3 didn't really do much for setting up the next overarching plot beyond finishing up Iron Man's story. But this is the film that I think gets the ball rolling for the other stuff. Like, again, we mentioned like with Odin mentioning the various artifacts that were created before the universe, saying that the rest of them look like stones, while the Aether was just was more viscous and malleable. But then, of course, we get the confirmation that there is something bigger going on as we see Volstagg and Sif go to the Collector and give him the Aether, and they confirm that the Aether is actually one of the Infinity Gems, or as the MCU calls them, the Infinity Stones. And not only confirm that the Aether is one of the Infinity Stones, but so is the Tesseract. And if you know Marvel lore, then and suddenly you think, oh, wait a minute, are they actually going to have the Infinity Stones in this? And honestly, I thought that was actually, when I heard that and I was able to put the pieces together, I was interested. I was completely interested. I'm thinking, wait a minute, so they're actually going to have stuff like that? And with the reveal of Thanos at the end of Avengers, suddenly you kind of put the piece together and you realize, oh my god, they're going to be doing Infinity Gauntlet. But it also made you wonder, well, where are the other Infinity Stones then? And it suddenly makes you wonder how they're going to be introducing them throughout the course of the rest of the films. As they introduced the Tesseract as one stone, and now they just introduced another stone in the form of the Aether. So you're kind of wondering where the other stones are and what else they can do. And it makes you interested and it makes you want to see more. And I like that. That is more mythos building that I can get behind and I think is really fun. But while there are some good emotional moments and some good humor, some good mythos building, unfortunately the rest of the film kind of drags it down for the most part, and unfortunately it makes this film just bad. Not awful, and there are things in there that I was okay with. Again, acting was fine, characters were fun. The characters were fine. Well, the main characters anyway. The main heroes. Anyway, yeah. The mythos building was nice. The moments between Thor and Loki were cool. The reaction to the mother's death was good. It's just that poor storytelling, bland side characters, bland villains, bland environments, and bland action unfortunately just lead to a bland film, which I don't like saying, but that's ultimately what this film boils down to. It's bland. A bland movie that unfortunately I find to be the low point of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So, yeah. If you like this, but again, if you actually did like Thor: The Dark World, more power to you. If you liked it, please explain in the comments why you enjoyed it. Maybe you saw something there that I didn't. Just don't be a jerk about your opinions, and just kind of. And I hope for you to respect my opinions, and I'll respect yours too. But I think that's all I can say about it. So, yeah. Next time we meet, however, we are going to be looking at what is considerably a much better movie than Thor: The Dark World, as we go back in to check in with the Star-Spangled Man with a Plan with Captain America: The Winter Soldier.